Hello, Tigers. Welcome to a special snow day edition of the NMC 341 video lecture series. Um, okay, so I have two lecturette, mini talks to share with you today. I'm gonna introduce you to probably the closest to the perfect bullshitter that I know of. That would be Jack Kelley. And I'll walk you through the whole thing. That's probably a 20-minute talk. Then I've got about another 20 minutes in which we're going to talk about signaling theory. And this is it's a little bit wonkier, but the payoff on signaling theory is pretty good. I'm betting that you'll be intrigued. Let's start with Jack Kelley though. And that means I need to do my slideshow thing, and we'll get this party started. Okay, so let's start off by trying to light your bullshit buzzer on fire. So grab a hold of your wallet and hold on tight. Somalia's Samaritan gives love to the dying. Italian volunteer and inspiration amid Hara by Jack Kelley, USA Today. America Somalia. She's known as the Mother Teresa of Somalia, but if she had it her way, Annalena Tonelli would rather not be known at all. Quote, "You don't need to talk to me," says Tonelli, 49, running from machine gun fire with a crying child in each arm. "Just look at the reality. It speaks for itself." Okay, got it? Now, play that scene in your head. What's it look like? I don't know if you can imagine a 49-year-old woman running away from a machine gun with two armloads of apparently anonymous but still crying children and saying anything more complicated than "look out." But if you can imagine that, props to you, because I can't. But apparently Mike Kelley could, or his editor could. And that's not because the editor was stupid. No, there was another reason why he or she was so gullible when it came to Jack Kelley. And that's why we're talking about this case today, because when Jack Kelley wrote that story, it was 1992. He was 12 years away from being busted for making stuff up. But as you can see, he was already on his way. So the thing to understand about Jack Kelley, and the reason he's kind of more interesting than the other case studies we've done, is that he wasn't a mediocre journalist trying to cheat his way to stardom, or a young, inexperienced journalist trying to cheat her way to a better position than she'd earned so far. He was a genuine journalistic superstar trying to cheat his way to I don't know what. Superstardom, maybe. Anyway, in any case, that fact made him a particularly tough nut to crack, and was probably why he went so long without being busted. Here's what he looked like. He was a top-ranking student at the University of Maryland in the early 1980s, and when it came time to graduate and get a job, he walked right into the offices of a brand new startup newspaper called USA Today and asked for one. And they must have liked his moxie, because soon he was working there as a news assistant. Now, this was before USA Today was officially launched. So when it did publish its first issue on September 15th of 1982, Jack was on the ground floor. He had a byline in the first issue. Soon, Kelley established a reputation for working harder than anyone else in the building and never ever letting an editor down. Now, you remember from the Janet Cook story about letting editors down, right? One thing that editors really like is sexy stories. If you pitch a sexy story and it turns out not to be a story, and you go back to the editor and say, "Never mind, I was wrong," you're letting the editor down, aren't you? Apparently, Jack never had to do that. I guess we know why. Soon he was a regular staff writer at USA Today. It became official in 1986. He covered the space shuttle explosion. A few years later, he was the go-to guy for a series of televangelist scandals involving Oral Roberts and Jimmy Swaggart and Jim Baker. Kelley was a born-again Christian, so assigning him to a story like that removed from the newspaper from having to be worried about people thinking it was an anti-Christian hit piece. By mid 1988, Kelley was at the top of the pecking order. He was on the foreign desk, he was regularly reporting from faraway places, starting with Cuba, and he was quickly developing into something of a prodigy. He seemed to have the magic touch. He would parachute into a foreign land and somehow establish trust and rapport with key locals, and within a day or two, he'd be filing smokers. In other words, Jack Kelley was a super trucker, a guy whose superhuman performance is your best marker that he's cheating. Like any super trucker, he started collecting hard feelings among the honest reporters who he was regularly showing up. But, and here's the interesting thing, and the thing that puts Kelley into a class by himself, above the workaday bullshitter, if you challenged him on a story, he'd back it up. If that's something you will have picked up on if you're a careful reader on the American Journalism Review article about Kelley on Canvas that I posted for the reading. And I don't know if you guys are caught up in the reading, but if not, pause the video and go read the Jack Kelley stuff, because you'll find it interesting. But the thing is, the guy really did have quasi-superhuman people skills. The people who knew him and worked with him were constantly amazed. He'd chat up the teenager behind the motel checkout desk. He remembered people's names. He'd remember their children's names. By the time he'd settled into a hotel, he would have introduced himself to the maid and the janitor and everyone else in sight. Really, he was the archetype of what Malcolm Gladwell calls a connector, which means that even though he was a bullshitter, and many people strongly suspected it, they never really knew if they had the goods. They never really knew if they could get away with calling him on it. Now, people did occasionally try to call him, and got humiliation for their trouble. Here's the BBC. The British Broadcasting Company got its finger stung that way when Kelley, through one of his many contacts in the field, scooped the world. In a groundbreaking interview of the new president of Pakistan, the BBC published a follow-up story that all but called bullshit on it. Now, the Pakistani foreign ministry was like, yeah, no, that didn't happen. And the BBC was like, hey, the foreign ministry says that didn't happen. They had to walk it all back a couple days later because it was legit. Kelley really had gotten that interview. He had not been bullshitting that time. You can imagine, though, what that did to other would-be whistleblowers whose bullshit buzzers Kelley was regularly setting off with crazy stories like that Anna Tonelli one, right? Could they call him on it, or would they end up getting their heads handed to them? I mean, here seemed to be a super trucker who was the real thing, an actual Superman. And that's why for more than a decade after Kelley began augmenting his work, a little at first and then more and more, but he wasn't called on it. Because colleagues would call bullshit around the water cooler, but nobody was going to take it to the next level, because when they did, like in 2001, he did a story about the special forces in Afghanistan hunting for Osama bin Laden. Well, it turned out to be the real thing. So anyway, under cover of this unusual competence, Kelley kept up a steady flow of stories that would later turn out to be bullshit. And here's the key to his shtick. High-profile stories, the straws that would break the camel's back, the ones that would make people go, okay, this time we finally got him, those would turn out to be legit. It was the lesser ones he cheated on. So in other words, like, Janet Cook cheated on her big centerpiece blockbuster to get the big story that would make her famous and got caught almost right away as a result. Kelley cheated on the lower-profile stories to free up enough time to get the big blockbuster stories legitimately. Frankly, I have to give him shout-outs for that one, because it really was pretty brilliant. And it probably would have worked pretty well for him if he hadn't gotten a little cocky in the early 2000s. Kelley got bolder as the decade wore on. Started out in 1992 with a story about Germans hating on gypsies, which was largely cribbed from a Washington Post story. In 1999, about the same time he started really getting careless, he reported that he had found a notebook on a dead Yugoslav soldier containing direct official orders to wipe out a village, which of course is evidence of war crimes. The next year, it was the gripping drama of Cuban refugees drowning at sea. And the year after that, he claimed to have personally witnessed a suicide bombing. In this quote, arms and legs rained down in the street. And also described Israeli settlers murdering a taxicab full of Arabs. That was pretty much the point at which the wheels came off of the Jack Kelley bus, though. Not necessarily because he had gone too far, although he certainly had, but because of this guy. This is Jason Blair. He was a reporter for the New York Times, and he sat in his Manhattan apartment running cocaine up his nose and stealing stories from other newspapers and making stuff up until he was caught. It's not a very interesting. It's interesting-ish, but it's almost like, commodity bullshitter at this point. We're not really, we can't talk about all the bullshitters. Anyway, Blair worked for the New York Times, and if you can make it up there, you can make it up anywhere. So his example got a lot of executive editors thinking, I wonder if we got one of those on staff at our place. So they start scrounging through story archives looking for possible weaknesses. And about this same time, an anonymous letter arrived at USA Today saying, hey, you know that Blair guy? Kind of a punter compared to your Jack Kelley. You might want to take a look at his stuff, Suddenly, his entire 16-year career at USA Today was under the microscope, and it was not holding up well. The investigation got started in June of 2003. In October of 2003, Kelley filed his last story, and the following month, he quit cooperating with his bosses and lawyered up. He had reason to be worried. It turned out the editors at USA Today had learned that he had had a friend pose as a translator to confirm the Yugoslav army issues orders to wipe out villages story in '99. So early in 2004, he was asked for his resignation. He said, okay, you can quit or you can get the axe. So he went ahead and quit. And at that point, the paper switched its focus from investigating Kelley to assessing the damage he'd done. They assigned a team of 3 reporters to work for 3 months sifting through the body of work. And it's their report that I posted in the on Canvas for you guys. This is a screenshot of their that's what the USA Today web page looked like in 2004. Awesome, huh? So what are we left with here? Basically, it's a cautionary tale. When faced with a super trucker who regularly rings the bullshit buzzer, but every time you look into it, something, it turns out to be legit, look a little further. Think of the example of Jack Kelley before you decide your instincts are leading you astray. And the next time you see the bullshit fly, sure, check into that high-profile claim. But when it turns out to be legit, don't just give up and assume the super trucker is superhuman. Another thing, too, about Jack Kelley, and this is a little odd, but I'm going to play us out with one more quote from a Jack Kelley story. And it's one that's in the reading of the American Journalism Review. I want to make a point with it, so I'm going to quote from it at length. In describing his brush with the Chechen mafia in the Christian Reader magazine, Kelley talks of praying as he ran through the streets, and then of an image coming to him of an apartment building with the number 925 on it, and an elderly man next to a door up one flight of stairs. Next thing he knows, there's building 925 and an old man beckoning him in. He told the magazine he waited in an apartment with a blue sofa and a stocked refrigerator until his pursuers passed. When his interpreter went back the next day to thank the old man, she found the apartment had been vacant a year. Kelley told the magazine, this was just one of many times God has spared me. Okay, so what's he doing here? He's actually claiming a miracle, a direct divine intervention in the human world, a bona fide, honest-to-God, free wine into water or water into wine miracle, staged by God Almighty to rescue him from a war zone in which anyone less special would have simply been killed. Now, you may not believe in that sort of thing, or perhaps you do, but either way, you'll have to admit that it is, to put it as charitably as I possibly can, extremely unlikely to have happened. I mean, when you're dealing with a Jack Kelley and you're afraid to call bullshit on him, don't overlook stuff like this, because the laws of physics are the laws of physics, and they don't make exceptions for any newspaper's golden boy. Well, there we go. We actually burned through that information fairly quickly. You may want to, slow down the playback. Maybe I was talking too fast. But that's Jack Kelley, our favorite bullshit ninja. Now, I'm going to go ahead and cue this next one up. And I'm going to talk about signaling theory. And this is one of the more interesting aspects of bullshit detecting and kind of like angles on it. And its connection to fake news. I really kind of hate stuff with stupid puns in the title, but I just couldn't resist this opportunity because this is kind of perfect. The advent of fake news is nothing less and not much more than a giant shift in the signaling systems that we use to decide what stories to believe and which ones to discount as deception or satire or fiction. So, okay, I'm going to give you the TLDR here. The old systems don't work anymore, but lots of people are still using them, and lots of unscrupulous people are using them to swindle people. Let's start with a story from a few years ago. I don't know if you remember this story. We talked about it in like week 3. Back in 2012, a woman calling herself Lisa Quinn logged on to Reddit and posted this picture. "Opinions, please, Reddit," she writes. "Do you think my Uncle Joe was just weird or a serial killer?" She said she'd found these old newspaper clippings in the bottom of a steamer trunk, and also she'd found Uncle Joe's diary, which made it sound like he'd moited 4 women in New York City in the late 1890s. So Lisa made a blog about it, sharing her story, and now she was asking Redditors for help. Here is her blog. I found things in the trunk. Redditors quickly discovered that all 4 of the victims were real unsolved murder cases from the 1890s in New York. And they found that all 4 of the murdered women had Wikipedia pages. One of those pages included speculation that maybe she'd been done by Jack the Ripper himself. And there was great excitement on Reddit for about 20 minutes. Now, spoiler alert, right? You guys already know it turned out to be bullshit, but work with me here. What about this story, as I've told you and shown it so far, would lead you to suspect that it's maybe not legit? Those of you who've done extensive archive research involving old newspapers will hit on one thing right away. This is really obviously fake. It's copy paper stained with tea and burned on the edges. And no 1890s headline writer would ever use the phrase "groping around" in that headline there. "The police groping around for the perpetrator of the latest butchery," followed by the words "stabbed in the abdomen." That's another word that you would never find in an 1890s headline. But, what is a red flag at its heart? It's an unexpected inconsistency in the signal. I just jumped ahead in my notes. So, this is where some video editing would come in handy for me, right? So these are red flags, these things. The strange text, the obviously fake artifact. These are red flags. What is a red flag at its heart? It is an unexplained inconsistency in a signal. I'm going to explain that further. Signaling theory is a concept that I'm borrowing from evolutionary biology, but it applies in spades to bullshit. In evolutionary biology, it manifests itself like this. The peacock with the largest tail is signaling the peahens that he's the most viable mate. That signal is probably honest, and he probably is the most viable mate because of evolutionary pressure. So long as tail size correlates strongly with peacockly studliness and virility, the peahens can select the best one just by looking at the tail. Evolutionary pressure keeps the signal honest because it's in the species' best interest for the females to be able to easily pick the best mate. So it's not, of course, in the individual best interests of any given less studly male peacock. So every less studly peacock wishes he had a bigger tail, or would if he weren't a stupid bird. But the point is, he wants the big tail so he can impress his ladies with the tail. Impress the ladies with his tail. He doesn't know or care that the tail is an index of his awesome, which is wanting, right? That's the thing. Now, say a freak peacock is born who can control tail size independent of his general studliness, right? As somebody's Jewish grandmother would say, how nice for him. But if his offspring inherit that ability, the tail size signal would go from being an honest signal to a dishonest signal. Tail-controlling peacocks would enjoy a brief period during which the good times would roll, but eventually the hens would figure out what's what and start picking mates in a different way, or they might start figuring out that fake tails have a certain look to them and start using that as a red flag to make a closer inspection before making a mating decision, or they might just die out. Most birds are not creative thinkers. Speaking of intellectually challenged birds, this is Nigel. Or rather, this was Nigel. He died early this year. That's kind of him looking off to the side there. The two that are looking straight up are made of concrete. They're decoys. Now, you may have heard this story. It got a lot of press a couple of years ago. The New Zealand government wanted to reestablish a gannet bird colony on a small island, so they put out a bunch of cement decoys looking to lure some birds in. Only one bird showed up. That was Nigel. He arrived in 2015 and promptly fell in love with one of the cement decoys. He built it a nest. He spent hours grooming its fake feathers, and he died beside it 3 years later. Now, it's so sad. We can't anthropomorphize Nigel too much here, but it's really sad to think of the poor blighter pining away after his statuesque beauty, waiting for her to wake up. I mean, statuesque for real, right? And it's hard not to wonder just a little bit if he ever suspected the truth, or did he not allow himself to doubt? If you have spent 2 years waiting for Sleeping Beauty to wake up, which is literally a third of your life if you're a gannet bird, you're kind of invested in that narrative. This, of course, is the sunk cost fallacy, heavily spiced with the confirmation bias, or what was that, lock-in in a journalistic context? You want to believe, you need to believe, so you wait for her to wake up, and then one day you die, and a lot of strangers on the other side of the world read about you in the Washington Post and feel very sorry for you. But Nigel fell for a dishonest signal that he thought was 100% reliably honest. Yellow feathers, beak, long neck, and a soundtrack of bird calls being played by outdoor speakers. That was a signal that had always before meant, hey, there's gannet birds here. Welcome home, brother birdie. But the signal was now dishonest. So like the fake gannet birds, this Alice Walsh clipping wants you to think it's an 100% honest signal. According to the signaling theory, what are the signals that are being presented here to make you think this is a true story? We got the style of presentation. It looks like an old newspaper. The weathering, which makes it look old. The complicatedness and plausibility of the story, found in a steamer trunk, and so forth. Now here's the key insight. Before those concrete gannet bird decoys came along, a group of gannet birds looking at the sky and squawking was a 100% reliably honest signal that a colony of gannet birds was on that island waiting for Nigel to come and join them. Nigel could depend on that signal. He could make life-changing decisions on its basis without worrying about being led astray. When the concrete birds were deployed, that signal changed to dishonest. But Nigel couldn't know that, so he ended his life pining for love at the feet of a concrete statue. Before desktop publishing technology reached a certain point around 1995, an artifact like this was a 100% reliably honest signal that you were looking at a story that had really an honest-to-God free run in an old newspaper. End of argument. It was an honest signal because you could not fabricate it. Well, now you can, right? So we are like the peahens who are starting to realize that some peacocks can control their tail size. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to discard all truth claims regardless of the quality of their signaling? I mean, if we do that, there's some advantages. If all truth claims are created equal, we get to pick the ones we like the best. So reality, or rather our perception of it, becomes a popularity contest, or maybe a reflection of the exercise of power. Which of these photographs shows the true size of the Inauguration Day crowds in 2016? Whichever one you want, right? Because reality's not going to slap you upside the face if you decide that you're going to put your faith and trust in this one versus this one. These are alternative facts. Depending on which of the two narratives you want to believe, you can select one or the other of these as your chosen peacock tail. If you select the one on the left, you align yourself with the desires of those in power. If you select the one on the right, you align yourself against those desires. Which narrative is true? Well, you can't tell anymore by looking at the tail. The peacock's tail no longer correlates to the studliness of the peacock. The professional appearance of the web page no longer correlates to the reliability of the news. So you either get to pick, or you start inspecting those tails much more closely than you used to have to. This is a pain in the butt, but the stakes are really high. I mean, they were pretty high for poor Nigel. Inability to tell honest from dishonest signaling ruined his whole life. They're pretty high for us, too. This is him grooming the feathers of his chosen concrete girlfriend. They're pretty high for us, too, and a lot of people have not yet realized that something that's critical to understand, something that, frankly, millennials are a lot better at figuring out than people my age seem to be. And you go a generation past me, and it's even worse. Digital production tools have ruined all the honest signals. There are no signals you can know with 100% certainty are honest. Until a year and a half ago, if you had video of President Obama looking into the camera and saying, "Yeah, I murdered a guy last week," you would probably change your opinion of President Obama. But now you'd be like, "Oh yeah, that's just a deep face swap." Right? There aren't any more honest signals. There's no peacock whose tail can be depended on to always reflect his studliness. But that doesn't mean those signals are useless. It just means you have to look closely at the feathers and cross-reference the other signs of peacock studliness before you give your heart to the one with the most beautiful plumage. How do you do that? Well, here's the thing. The thing to remember, and the key to telling honest from dishonest signaling in media content, you know where I'm going with this, right? Yes, the prime directive. Oh, and WTF, where's the filthy lucre? The story of Alice Walsh. Who was telling that story? Let's drill down and figure this one out, because that's exactly what Reddit did in 24 minutes. Some rando with a stock format WordPress blog and some pictures. That's the 2014 format of WordPress. I know, I tried to run WordPress in 2014. If you know what you're doing, WordPress is great. If you don't know what you're doing and you don't have time to learn what you're doing, just don't even waste your time. Anyway, the pictures look pretty good from far away, but we don't get much in the way of high-res views. And they're all from the same source, this WordPress blogger. And there are also Wikipedia entries for the 4 murder victims, which sounds like independent collaboration. Well, within an hour, someone had posted this comment, which is, let me expand it because I can't stick my head around there and see the on that side. I know I'm probably being cynical, but does this seem like viral marketing to anyone? I mean, the fact that Alice Walsh Wikipedia article was created 2 weeks ago, and the way the articles in the picture look like they're falsely aged, and then we get maybe not be viral marketing, just someone trolling, but the inclusion of 2 recently made Wikipedia articles made me feel like this was supposed to be bigger, reference to a movie or something. And then we get this guy goes, "Damn, original poster went through all that trouble to fool us and gets called out in only 26 minutes. Reddit, you are a cruel mistress." Yeah, this was literally 26 minutes later. The other Redditors were like, "Oh yeah, that's kind of a red flag. This looks like a fun game. Let's look more closely and see if we can find more." And it just started unraveling from there. The Wikipedia articles have been posted and edited by a small group of very new users. Finding documents in an old steamer trunk seemed a little on the nose, as screenwriters say. And why had Lisa been savvy enough to ask Reddit for advice, but not savvy enough to Google the name and find the Wikipedia pages? Just like that, months of work lay in ruins. Took less than an hour. It turned out that the whole thing had been put together, as you know, because I already told you the story, by a class of undergraduates at George Mason University, where their rascally professor had created a class called Lying About the Past, which, honestly, I have to give him props for that. Grudging props, though, because I'm just not in the business of lying about the past. For what reason, I know not, but he created this class, and the whole thing was someone's term project. But I'm going to finish off this lecturette by circling back to that imaginary peacock, the one who's figured out how to control his tail. Although peacocks are especially stupid birds, I bet within a few generations the signaling value of tail size would be completely gone. Right? With humans, the process of a compromised signal losing its value is much faster. 20 years ago, only a few people had the technical ability to Photoshop a photograph. Today, everybody has, and is using it to create memes. If someone showed you a photograph of Hillary Clinton robbing a bank, you would instantly distrust the signal. And you'd look at all of it, you probably wouldn't even bother. You probably wouldn't even bother to take it apart and ask, well, would Hillary Clinton really be using a cheap 38 special, Saturday Night Special to do a bank robbery, or would she invest in a larger firearm and any of that kind of stuff? Why even bother? You just already know there's people out there trying to make the case that she's running a child trafficking sex ring out of a pizza shop in Manhattan. Of course, they're going to have something of her robbing a bank. No, it's just bullshit, and we're not even going to bother fact checking it. Right. 30 years ago, if someone showed you a photograph of Ronald Reagan robbing a bank, well, 30 years ago, you'd be dead probably. But if 30 years ago someone had showed me a photograph of Ronald Reagan robbing a bank, I'd probably believe it. You know the Alice's Restaurant song, right? That hippie anthem thing about the draft and whatnot, eight and a half by 11 color glossy photographs with a paragraph on the back of each one explaining what each one was. Or I guess it was 8.5 by 10 color glossy photographs. And these are like hardcore evidence. There's like, these guys are going to get convicted of littering because of these color glossy photographs that don't lie. It's changed. The signaling has changed. The peacock's tail doesn't say nothing. Pergo laminate flooring. I don't know if any of you guys are hip enough to construction materials, but Pergo laminate flooring is basically a photographic image of an expensive hardwood floor printed on big slabs of thin material that you snap together. It's very easy to install, and it's quite inexpensive compared to the stuff that it's made to look like. And when it first came out, it was super popular. It was $1,000 a room floor that looked like a $15,000 a room exotic hardwood floor, and people installed it, and for a little while they felt like playas. But then what happened? The appearance of that floor had formerly been a reliable signal that you'd spent 15 grand on the floor of your living room. Now it was an unreliable signal of that, so people start looking for other signals. The way the light shines on the surface, for instance, or the lack of cracks between every board, or the way it sounds when you walk on it. Clop, 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 rather than whatever real hardwood sounds like. So within a very few years, Pergo no longer sent the $15,000 signal. It sent the $1,000 signal plus a new signal, which was the people who installed this wanted you to think they paid $15,000 for their floor. So there's that. Same thing here. 20 years ago, this would have worked. People would have been like, well, that doesn't look like old newspapers I've seen, but it looks old, so it must be legit. And who's got the ability to make something like that up? Today, anybody who's seen old newspapers will instantly recognize it and probably even dope out how it was done by the uneven staining patterns. Signals degrade when they stop being reliable. Sometimes with blinding speed, life is actually bullshit resistant. I mean, so take heart. Actually, I participated in this whole thing myself. Once upon a time in the mid-1990s, when I was in the publishing business, so I had access to fonts that looked a lot like the newspaper font that was used in the Eugene Register Guard, and I faked up a Register Guard article that said that my brother-in-law, who is a veterinarian, who was a zoo veterinarian actually at the time for wildlife safari, he has a much more interesting life than I do. He had his license to practice as a veterinarian revoked by the state, and he used this to pull a very mean prank on his parents, which I don't think they've even yet completely forgiven him or me for. But you couldn't do that now. People were like, oh, huh. Well, I wonder if that's real. Oh, well, what else is happening today? So, yeah, the signals change. I mean, there's like a couple of years of the peacocks with the adjustable tails having just the time of their lives, and then woof, it's all gone. Life's bullshit resistant. You just have to wait a little while. You also have to worry about who's rushing through major systemic changes under cover of the newly available bullshit. That's the big one. And if you have the opportunity to buy a cheap thing that looks like an expensive thing, also, this is a great dynamic to keep in mind. Vinyl siding. You know how vinyl siding looks terrible? When it first came out, it looked so awesome. It looked like really expensive siding. And now you just kind of look at it and see how it droops, and you're like, oh yeah, vinyl siding. Yeah, a lot of signals that have deteriorated over the years. I thought of one earlier, and I was going to share it, going off script. I can't freaking remember what it was, and I'm not going to waste your time trying. So I'm just going to call this good. Uh, is this really? I don't know if the timing is right, but I don't see how this could possibly only be 20 minutes, but I guess maybe it is. Anyway, well, that's all I had queued up for today. So I guess well, I may, since I'm only 20 minutes into this, I may pull up another one. Um, but anyway, that might be the thing to do. Okay, so I'm gonna pull the plug on this particular show, and I'll see you guys on Wednesday. I may see if I can post another lecture to get us a little bit ahead too. Okay. Now, of course, there's the wandering around and getting this thing to stop.